I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. And it has been a minute since I interviewed Ocean Vuong for the old BNN podcast, which I had 2016, 2017. It was On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, which was the debut novel that really ran up the bestseller list really quickly. And that was a delight to see. We don't always get to see that with debut novels. There was another poetry collection in between, Time as a Mother, and now there is a new novel, which is extraordinary. It is a major American epic novel of found family and place and class, and it is a New England that not everyone's going to recognize, though some of us, well, if you've read Andre Dubus's Townie, his memoir, some of this territory will be familiar, but The Emperor of Gladness is a remarkable, remarkable novel, and we get to hang out with Ocean, at least for a little bit today, and I'm very excited. It's so good to see you. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you, Miwa. Thank you so much for thinking through my works, and it's always an honor to talk to you and any place.
Well, thank you. But I have a question. When did you start writing this? Because I feel like you were writing Time as a Mother sort of concurrently with Emperor of Gladness, yeah?
Yeah, I started, I have a notebook somewhere that says I started this on January 18th, 2020.
Wow.
In earnest. Parts of it I was thinking through and how to fit in. I wrote maybe 15 pages of it while working on Earth.
Okay.
It just didn't fit in, it didn't work, and so I
Okay.
laid it to the side. Well, Time as a Mother is interesting because that was actually my thesis at NYU.
Oh.
So I don't know, I guess you can call it career, is a little strange in that when I was on my way to graduate school, in 2014, I got a phone call from Copper Canyon Press that said they wanted to publish my book that I sent to them a year prior. So it was very surreal. So I walked into the MFA program with a contract, and it was a great opportunity because I got to edit my book of poems in an MFA, which is such a rare luxury. I went to my director, who's now my boss, Deborah Landau. She's incredible. And I said, I got a contract. Can I just use this time to edit my book? And I think I'm historically probably the most unproductive NYU student because I've written only one new poem since I was there. I cobbled together something. I had to give something for my thesis because my book is already out in the world when I graduated. And my thesis was probably 65-70% of Time as a Mother. And then I just added a couple things and I wrote maybe 2 poems, but I edited it after my mother passed. And then so it was infused with this new grief. But the work was pretty much calcified. Emperor is the first book in my life that I wrote from start to finish without my mother being alive. And that was really, really hard. And there was a notebook. If I may, can I just grab it?
Yeah, absolutely. Please. Oh, I love that. I love that.
And then this is the front page.
Mm-hmm. Wow. 7 weeks.
And I filled it all the way to the brim.
Yeah.
And so that's where it started. And it was kind of, it's like I'm finally, I guess, truly an orphan. So it's been strange. It's been strange. I've been very ambivalent about this book in ways that are surprising to me, I think.
What do you mean?
I guess everything in my life, I told myself I was, this sort of radical formalist and things that you work towards as a student. And I had such great teachers that I'm breaking the form, doing these things. And in retrospect, I realized I was actually just doing everything for my mother. I was doing like the immigrant child thing where I just wanted to find success so I can get her a home, get her out of the projects, take care of my little brother who's dyslexic, my cousin. I was doing that quintessential first generation upward mobility thing. And I was quite conservative formally in my maneuvers, even though I told myself I was like doing this radical stuff. I was actually, in retrospect, really conservative and being like the good student. I see that especially in my first book of poems, like it's kind of showing my work. Look, everyone, I read the canon. I considered it deeply. Here are my allusions to the canon. please let me sit at the table, you know. And it wasn't until my mother passed where I had to really write for myself. And of course, every writer wants that, is prepared for that. I did not expect to answer that question, what would I write if I wrote for myself, until maybe I was like in my 50s or 60s. But when my mom died, I had to ask that. And I asked it, I didn't, it's not a question I wanted to ask, but it was what was in my lap. And so I feel a little bit, maybe I'm like, if I love it too much, I would betray her. I don't know. It's a little silly, but I think that's what I feel.
I don't think it's silly. I think you're navigating space. I mean, when I say that The Emperor of Gladness is a really deeply American novel, to me, it feels like one of these books that captures this exact moment in time, right? And there's such a ferocious sense of place. You are such a New Englander. You are such a kid from Connecticut who has had a really different experience from some immigrant stories, right? Because I feel like you do still pull quite a lot from your own biography. I mean, you dip it in and out in different ways, but I sort of feel like this book was inevitable for you. I'm just glad you didn't make us wait another 15 or 20 years. I feel like you're planting sort of a flag in your sense of what this place is. And I love the idea, though, that you knew this was coming. I mean, I'm sorry your mother's not here to see it. I would love to have seen her response. But also, honestly, there were easier ways for you to buy her a house. You could have become an ophthalmologist or a pharmacist or an accountant or, I mean, all of those things you were never going to do, right? Like,
yeah. I failed into this art. You know, I went to business school and I dropped out. And I guess the dream was never to, it sounds strange. I hope it doesn't sound disingenuous, but the dream was never to be an author. It wasn't a dream that was available to me. Like when I was a kid growing up in the projects, no one said, check poet in the checkbox, right? So being a writer was as true as being a unicorn. And it was something I completely fell into. But I think what I did wanted to find out when I was around 15, 16 was pretty much, why is there so much suffering? And yet, why do we as a species have such capacity to recognize wonder and beauty? And what is that function in the world? And writing was something I had a knack in, but I don't have an allegiance to it as a vocation, but I'm using it to funnel the questions through. And so far, it's been capacious for me, but I don't have any. It wasn't the dream to have an author photo and go on tour. Not that that's a bad dream to have. It just was not conceivable to me. I'm not trying to denigrate it, but it was the question was always, what is this? Why are we here? And why is it so painful and so beautiful all at once? And you mentioned autobiography, and I think for me, it's really important for me to lean in to autofiction and also reorient autofiction, because so much of it has been dominated by this early aughts discourse around white writers negotiating white ennui, boredom, vexation of modern life, which often gets criticized for navel gazing or self-absorption. But I hope that autobiography in the fictive propulsion could be stretched further, because for me, what's interesting about autofiction is history.
Yeah.
You can't turn your back from the history you lived and the history that you're imagining yourself in. And so to write autofiction as a refugee, as a person of color, is to always be in contention with a hyper-politicized moment in time and the aftermath therein, right? So to write autofiction, as a Vietnamese American in the 21st century, is to write after the Imperial War in Vietnam, right after the Civil Rights Movement, to right after the reality of American slavery. All of that is at the nexus. And I always say this, my autofiction inspirations are the Japanese writers.
Yep.
Shishoshetsu, right? started at the turn of the 20th century with Natsume Soseki, and from there you go to Tanizaki, of course, Mishima, and Murata's Convenience Store Woman, right? So that alternative predecessor to Western autofiction is deeply vexed with the great changes of the Meiji Restoration, right?
Yeah.
What is Japan? Where is it headed? It's an empire, but it's also difficult because it's in this entanglement with European imperial desires. So the question of the self, like how valid is a self in a dissolving cultural system, was hugely inspirational, and interiority for those Japanese writers. So for me, I'm turning to the East in ways that are not always legible to American conversations and discourse around autofiction. And unfortunately, so much of Western aesthetic tastemaking is finding white frameworks and then testing whether writers of color fit into pre-established white dominant frameworks. And I'm just not interested. I'm not even like oppositional to it. I think if you're opposition, you speak second. You're always correcting power. And I'm interested in something completely alternative to that, where I'm like, I'm just turning my back away. It's nice. I love it as much as anyone else. But I'm more informed by the Japanese writers and thereby the Korean and Chinese writers who are working with autofiction.
And I think that's how we get this extraordinary voice. I mean, I recognize you on the page, even if I'm flipping back and forth between the poetry and the prose, I still recognize you. And it feels like I've been reading you much longer than I have. I mean, 2014, right? Copper Canyon was 2014, 2015?
Yeah, 2016 it came out.
Okay, 2016.
Publishing poems, all over the place. Right. It took me 8 years to write that book.
You said something to Hua Shu of The New Yorker in an interview that I love, and I'm going to quote you for a second. The more I write, the more I realize that writing is predominantly a curatorial work, and it's about listening rather than making. And I feel like you're pulling all of these pieces of your experience as a queer Vietnamese American man, also partially the immigrant story, but also you are still this kid from Hartford, Connecticut, with very specific experiences. And yes, you've turned it into poetry and you've turned it into prose. And as a result, we get lines like memory is a choice, right? And that you've created this space where you've got a cast. I'm going to stick to Emperor of Gladness for a second because I love this cast, but you've given us these voices who are so of this piece of New England. You've got High's colleagues, you've got High's roommate, you've got High's cousin, and they're all living in translation. And it's not necessarily sort of Vietnamese into English. It's not necessarily Lithuanian into English. It's also how to be in the world when the world doesn't necessarily value your story. I mean, part of what was exciting for me about reading Emperor of Gladness was you're giving everyone an opportunity to show how many of us do live in translation regardless of what our backgrounds are. I'm thinking of Maureen, I'm thinking of BJ, I'm thinking of Wayne, I'm thinking of Russia.
Yeah.
All of these kids. So can we spend a minute talking about how your views of language and collection and story have evolved?
Thank you so much for thinking through that. I think of American life not so much as the shining city on the hill as it's often portrayed, but as a series of debris. And I think debris comes from somewhere, and the greatest artists are actually junkyard artists. They collect the debris, whether philosophically or materially, and then create something new out of it. And American bodies, coming from epicenters of great destruction, great geopolitical vexation, are debris. We are within the blast radius of history. We arrive where we are, and we look around and we see each other, different tongues, different ethnicities, different dreams, and yet we have to create a kinetic fusion with each other. And That's why to me, the fast food restaurant was the perfect place for that. And I did not want it to just be a plot point. I didn't want anyone to move on from it. I was not interested in progress or rags to riches or, this kind of material catharsis. Aristotle's decree that you have to have catharsis, a reversal of fates for a character to earn the audience's release. And it's interesting because Aristotle was responding to Plato's wish to ban the poets and makers, because poets would make the warriors emotional to Plato, and that would be horrible to the Republic, right? If your God forbid your warriors feel feelings like love and joy, you would lose the Republic. And Aristotle tried to find a middle ground, and he said, well, what if we took all the vexation of the populace and ameliorated with story? And so from there, you get the Colosseum, you get the Super Bowl, right? And so if you get secession, right? Why overthrow the rich when you can laugh at them and pity them from your couch? And so I think it becomes this kind of mechanism that supports a kind of fascistic governance of people. And I just did not, it fits very well with commercial prospects. You buy a washing machine, it promises to improve your life. You buy a car, it promises. And that happened with fiction too. You will find the body, you will know the murderer, the boy gets the girl gets the boy. You will go to college, and that will somehow economically resolve where you are. That's the quintessential American Bildungsroman. And so I thought, if I turn to the East and other modes of literary production, will I find a way? And luckily, with the Japanese and Russian writers, I found a different way to say, wait a minute, what if I just close off the system of progress and have no change? And again, I don't know if this book is going to do well because of that, right? It's just, but again, I feel like I could do it because I don't have a mom, and I didn't have a mother to take care of anymore, and I'm not afraid of failing anymore the way I used to be. And I just wanted to write a book that has transformation without change. It's something Wong Kar-wai said in an interview.
Yeah.
When he was doing In the Mood for Love, which is like, I'm like, oh, it blew my mind. I was like, oh my God, that's exactly it. That's it. They're stuck. These people are stuck in the apartment. And the desire is the weather system, but nothing happens. They can't act on it enough. They can't escape. And of course, it would be an Asian, non-American thinker that will give me a foothold on how to think about that. Because I feel like if I wrote this as a debut, my friends and mentors would say, this is fine, but this doesn't work in the American context. You need to give us something. You need to give us a deliverable or a payoff. And I think I only was able to do it as a second novel. I earned my innovations. I earned my daringness. And I thought, no, these people will be who they are and they will not improve. And that's not a bad life. The communities that I live with, my aunt works the same job for 30 years.
Yep.
My cousin works at Trader Joe's 10 years. They drive the same car for 20 years. That's, in every sense of American life, that's deemed a failure. For them, that is a dream. Stability, self-care, the capacity to earn one's own life and to live in peace, that is a desire for them. So I'm not so much interested in the monolithic American dream, in as much as I'm interested in Americans who dream individually and idiosyncratically.
I also feel like you have a profound respect for all of your characters. I read to have my world expanded. And I read and yes, there is a lot of your New England that I recognize without a doubt. I mean, but I don't necessarily want characters to be the punchline. Right? Like, their experience is so different from mine. I don't want them to be a punchline. Now, I will say there's a lot of humor in this novel. I mean, there's some folks who get some really great one-liners in there, and I think I feel like he's always talking with a slightly raised eyebrow, even if he doesn't know he's totally talking with a slightly
Yeah.
raised eyebrow. But I love that kid. And watching him interact with his cousin who really does not have the same skill set that he has. I mean, Sony, what a great kid. What a great kid. But again, his experience of the world and High's, even though they are first cousins and even though they are from the same place, still radically different. I don't ever feel like Sony is displeased with his life. And Sony actually knows more about his life than other people give him credit for. I'm dancing around a plot point as I say that, so I'm not going to go any further there, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. I mean, wonder for me has to be at the heart of it, of everything I do. That's what makes life worth living. And it's not hard to find. I think many people might be surprised. I don't know. I don't want to assume, but it's not hard to find, even in a blighted community like the ones I grew up in. You see it every single day. And I'm interested in utterances, speech acts that are not supposed to happen in the spaces that they occur, right? So like the people who design a fast food restaurant, they don't anticipate the coworkers telling each other vulnerable secrets, jokes, sharing knowledge, and yet that happens because human beings are going to be who they are. And I think regardless of what you believe in, your various ideologies, kinetic labor and kinship erodes all ideologies and beliefs. And I know that having worked in fast food, my what I didn't put in the novel was my actual boss, which I think is so idiosyncratically unique that if I did write him, I think James Wood would call it hysterical realism.
Okay.
Because I had an evangelical Christian refugee from Pakistan as a boss when I was working at Boston Market. And he had these huge nose pores, and he would eat this cornbread that we all ate on his break, and then the crumbs would get lodged in his nose. And then he would yell at us using like Christian guilt, using all these saints to kind of guilt us into working harder. And it was so comical and absurd. And yet, when it came time to get slammed, we all anticipated each other's needs. We knew by the cough who was behind us, by the gait, by the footsteps. And I think so much of American life is about nuclear families, and say found family might be antithetical to that. But I actually think what I'm interested in is what I would call circumstantial family.
Okay.
The family that are cobbled together on a work shift. You don't choose them, and yet there's enough kinship and yet enough anonymity that they get to come even closer to you in ways they wouldn't come to their priests or their wives and husbands and family. The things people told me when I worked there, they didn't even tell their own family because they knew that at 4 p.m., they're never going to see me again until the next shift.
Right.
And there's something about that I felt was underexplored in American fiction. And I really didn't want, you're so right in that. I didn't want to turn the fast food restaurant into a plot point, a launching, a setting. It had to be an ecosystem in its entirety.
I didn't want to leave them behind. I thought they were all fully formed and so genuine. And again, dancing around some things that we learn about each of them. And everyone earnest in their own way. There's a lot of love in that space. There's a lot of joy in that space. There's also just a lot of reality checking in that space. No one's pretending. Even if they're dreaming big, no one's pretending beyond sort of what the scope of their reality is. I mean, there is someone who, has some dreams of fame, but it's not, I'm moving to Hollywood or I'm going to Broadway. There is this thing that will make me famous in my community and I want to be a part of it.
It's when you know who I learned this from? Wes Anderson.
Okay.
When you watch his films, every character that appears has an idiosyncrasy wherein they could be the main character. They're never just completely functional. And for the first time, when I was watching Mount Rushmore or Moonrise Kingdom, I just thought, oh, that's how my experience of people are when I grew up in New England. everybody felt, I did not, because I was seeing in novels, the plot was a tyrannical force that turned all characters into functionaries. I don't die on many hills, but I'm deeply skeptical of Chekhov's credo that everything that appears, the shotgun appearing in Act 1 must go off in Act 3. That, well, there's a kind of, it fits very well into capitalism, right? If it doesn't fit, cut it out. And you see this in Hollywood films too, right? Moments of lulls and lacks are immediately cut out because they said, well, we're burning film, we're wasting money. We need to get off we're watching them breathe for too long. It's too quiet. And yet again, going back to Eastern narratology, Japanese narratology has a term called ma. And Miyazaki uses it incredibly, right? Ma is this quiet lull, a break in the action. And you see it in My Neighbor Totoro, in the bus stop scene. Spirited Away, you see it in the train scene, where you observe the characters feel what they've experienced. And again, in the West, that would be cut out. That's a waste of time. Move on, right? And so I'm interested in kind of this idea that if you take away, the plot exists in this book. It's a true hybrid of East and West. I even have like my silly little, let me show you my graph.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that. I absolutely love that.
This is Kisho Tenketsu, which is the Japanese form I use in On Earth. It's a 4-plot system.
Yep.
Right? Introduction, deepening, turn, accumulation. And then, but this novel is added the hero's journey. Yep. Afterwards, and you'll probably know what I'm talking about. But of course, the hero's journey is futile. It's Lord of the Rings, but there's no ring. Nothing. It doesn't work, right? So it's like the hero's journey occurs, but it doesn't bring any resolution. And I was trying to bring the Eastern strategies with the West for this book, and still preserve the characters' autonomy. And so they do things kind of like, spores or mycelium, like they go off and they do this thing and then they come back. And what they gain is a relationship, but the plot doesn't get resolved. It doesn't push anything on. Like, the hog butchering scene. I think in any traditional sense, that would have been cut, right? If we're talking about Western narratology, that would have been cut. But here it's so important because it functions as a gathering of people, of a community. You see more about the characters through that scene, even though it doesn't resolve anything in their material life.
So I'm going to tread gently for a second because this is your novel. And I'm not entirely sold on the idea that the hero's journey doesn't pay off at the end for Hai. I'm not totally sold on that. I absolutely understand. I mean, in the traditional sense of that narrative trope, sure, but I felt like I got a really great sense of resolution for him in that moment.
Yeah. Now, yes, you're absolutely right.
And it felt really solid and satisfying to me. And because if I look at how he's responding to what's happening and the choices he makes in that moment, you've led us right. The story has brought us there. It wouldn't have happened if he had not had the journey he had. And he is. Yeah. So anyway,
you're absolutely right.
I'm treading gently with you.
No, you're 100% right. This is why I said you're the best. Because he doesn't get what they're supposed to get. I'm not trying to spoil it. But then he realizes.
But he gets a thing.
He gets there,
He gets a thing. And, it's funny talking to you, too, about New England. I mean, and you've mentioned this in other interviews, but Emily Dickinson and Moby Dick. Yeah. We kind of have to come back to both of these for a second. I mean, obviously, there are so many other influences on your work, but I love the idea that I get this body of work from you that calls, and it took me a long time to come to Dickinson. I was one of those teenagers who's like, you can't make me. I know I'm supposed to take her seriously, but this chick sitting alone in her house, what am I supposed to do with this?
Yep.
And I was one of those people who read Moby Dick every year until I just didn't have time to sit down with all of the men in the whale again. And that's my loss, because part of me sort of thinks I should go back to doing that. But I love the idea that you can call back to these traditions that are not necessarily what people would have expected for you.
Oh, thank you. Well, I was also one of those kids who were very disobedient And it took me a long time to get to Dickinson too, because I thought, and it was a great turning point in my education as a writer, because I thought she was so spoken for that there was nothing left for me, right? She was taught in elementary schools. Everyone revered her. She was positioned as this wilting lily, trapped in her home, this kind of like mystical genius. And I said, okay, it feels pretty concluded, right? Well, who she is, what she is. But when I started to read her, again, with the suggestion of one of my teachers, Jen Bervin, when I had a fellowship at Poets House in New York City. It was a fellowship for folks who didn't have a graduate degree at the time. I didn't have one. She helped me rethink through, and I engaged Dickinson on just the terms of the material, not the cultural branding, which I learned was a huge misbranding, a huge misogynist reading, disarming. Like, she's so political, deeply vexed, writing in the middle of a war, all of the Western canon marching right up to her door in person and in books, and she just said, no, thank you. And also her letters, the epistolary form. And so as a 19th centuryist, as an undergrad, I was reading this and I just thought, oh my God, like, what is literature? What is a literary production? Because I don't see a difference between her poems and the master letters, the mysterious master letters that she wrote. Are they manifestos, treaties, prose poems, short stories, autobiography? It didn't matter. It was already nebulous and open. And the same way, Melville living, in Pittsfield, and I would add Harry Beecher Stowe, Wallace Stevens, Mark Twain, all those folks were part of that crux. And I wanted to, Toni Morrison really helped me think through this, where she said, look, Tolstoy never imagined a young Black girl from Lorain, Ohio would be reading War and Peace. And yet I am, because I can, and I will be inspired by it. Faulkner never imagined me as a writer, but I will read, Absalom, Absalom, and be inspired by it. And so there's that kind of, and I was really lucky to discover that quote from her early on, because it gave me the utmost permission to say, oh yes, I have a mind, and whatever I apply it to will be mine. No one can tell me what to read or what not to read. And of course, the culture expects you to read a certain way. It'll pigeonhole you, but you can't control that, and you have to always dodge. And I think you're onto something here, where I think like in the span of all my books, I'm always dodging. As soon as I think people are catching up to what I'm doing, I like to kind of just and I think I just don't want to. Maybe there's an Asian American vexation here about not wanting to be finally hunted and captured, right? There's a kind of fugitive impulse to not wanting to be understood. Like, I want to keep total comprehension of what I'm doing, like, away from me. Or rather, like, my books are almost like decoys for who I am. I'm like, well, you look at that book, I'm going to do something else. And it's not in total opposition to the culture or what have you. But I think it's just in like a more deeper boredom. Like, I want to find another way. I tell my students this. We talked about it last week. I said, guys, I know you're obsessed with finding a voice. And even the metaphor of finding and capturing the voice out, and possessing it, is a very American metaphor, right? Yes. I know you're told that you're anxious about establishing a style. I promise you the style is already in you. And it's really about going to the outskirts of what you think your style is. Venturing on the outskirts of your voice. Because then that will also be another center. And then you go to the outskirts of that. Go to the outskirts of the poem, right? There's one poem, you think you got it, everybody claps. But then my job for them is like, let's think about the outskirts of this poem. Where is this poem veering? And maybe that's how you write the next one. And so to me, I'm not interested in planting a flag of style or who I am ontologically. I'm interested in like constantly moving away from it. Maybe this is a Buddhist concept of like everything is in flux. All my books, I look at them and I'm like, these are just like photo albums taken in time. They don't represent who I am. Even when I get nice things like prizes, I remind myself this is awarded for a past act. It is not even an assessment of the present.
I think the work is the work. I'm happy when it stands, but I also think about, I mean, I've been in the book business a long time, and there are times where books have rolled through and you think, oh, this is the thing, and then it is gone. Occasionally I go back to someone's deep catalog and I think, oh, well, that was a really profound read, and I am not mentioning live authors right now. But that was a really profound book for me when I was 19 or 20, and oh, hey, that is basically now print on demand. Okay. That's why. And, not that long ago. And so when you see the evolution, and it's not just a marketplace of ideas, it's not just capitalism, it's also us evolving as a culture and as people and saying, well, that's actually not shocking anymore, or it doesn't hold the weight that it once did. I mean, if I think about all of the writers that I pull from sort of as, they've imprinted on my DNA, right? For want of a better phrase. There are some writers that I've held on very closely to, but if you met 18-year-old me, you would have to get an earful about Henry Miller. And 18-year-old me was not wrong. And 18-year-old me, he had I tried to reread Tropic of Cancer. Do not do that. I cannot recommend that experience. Now, that said, I still think 18-year-old me was onto something in that moment. It was just a really long time ago.
Yeah. The language finds us where we are, and then we move from it. And I think that's actually okay. Like, I think the anxiety around being timeless and relevant is, to me, a very specifically Western anxiety. Because you think about like things that are timeless in our world, actually kills us. PFAs, microplastics, forever chemicals. Like, should anything be forever? It's a real question that I have. And I just think while we're here, we contribute to the zeitgeist, and the zeitgeist itself is this rushing river. You toss your little book into that river, and that's it. Your contribution is finished, and you have to stay on the shore and maybe write something else. Maybe don't. I only work on one book at a time. I don't have multiple book contracts. My family gives me an earful when we have to like renovate a bathroom, and I said, well, you should have took more money. There was 3 books on the table where you could have done it, but I was trained as a poet, and you don't give anybody half a sonnet and say, I promise, 3 months later, I'll give you the second second half of 7 lines, and it'll be great. So proposals were so strange. I never done any of that, and to me, it's just one book at a time.
Well, one book at a time. There's an expansiveness to the Emperor of Gladness that I wouldn't have predicted based on reading the 2 poetry collections and on Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, because they were so intimate. And even when you're talking about the war and history and your family's history in the poetry collections, it's still, the voice is so intimate. You're clearly sort of figuring out what the form demands. I mean, that is the thing that poets don't always get credit for, which drives me around the bend. It's like, this is actually really hard. This is not like writing a jingle kind of thing, which also, yes, it's hard to write a jingle, but there's so many formal constraints to writing a poem.
Yes.
And when it's done well, you don't notice it. And when it's done poorly, you think, oh, thank you. Can I please excuse myself from the room right now? Right. But there's an expansiveness of thought. There's an expansiveness of history. I mean, as a country and as a culture, we have a lot of ideas about World War II, right? And there is an expectation, certainly for you as a Vietnamese American, that the war is always sort of right here. And I think it's true for a lot of Asian Americans, too. I mean, a lot of us, we all have an experience of someone else's experience of the Vietnam War. And the characters here, though, just kind of bring their authentic selves. And sometimes they tell the truth, and sometimes they don't.
Yeah. Well, that's it. I'm glad you said that, because I think for me, we have this puritanical lens about lying and deception in this country, right? The biggest faux pas a politician can do is flip-flop or lie, right? Meanwhile, they perform honesty and then lie in the back rooms and make these deals that, is pretty much like the theft of our livelihood as we're seeing now. But quite frankly, it's been like that as far as I've have eyes to see. And I think so there's a kind of instantly moral corruption to lying and deception. But you realize in this novel and in the life that I grew up that there is a benevolent deception. There's a fictive propulsion to lying. When you have nothing to give, these characters give each other myths so that they can tend to it. They have nothing. It's very easy to be kind if you're a billionaire because it doesn't cost you anything, or perform kindness or savior, right?
Right.
Giving people satellite access or what have you. But it doesn't cost you anything. And what I'm interested in growing up in the working poor was how often and how easily people were kind to each other, knowing they were powerless to truly transform each other's lives. I saw this sort of this generosity that nowhere in the culture really supported or nourished, and yet, like a stubborn weed, it kept coming up in the life I saw in New England. In New England, you're right, it's very interesting because it's so crammed and close. You can drive 30 minutes in any direction from a city center and be in a cornfield. You'll realize that the entire region is built on immigrants. It's one of the oldest places in the country, which means there are a lot of gravestones. It's filled with death. There's more cemeteries where I live than houses, right? And meanwhile, it's rich with Haitian, Dominican, Puerto Rican immigrants who came after World War II or during World War II to harvest the land and feed the country. You realize all of this. It's also very, very segregated. It has connotations of wealth and power, private schools. All that is true. It's a place of contradiction. In a sense, it is a place of fictional propensities. And that was really important for me to show that it's just because a lot of famous white people wrote about it doesn't mean they've exhausted the region. And as an Asian American to really come in and say, I was raised by this. There's something really specific about the imagery here. I'm raised on phantom land, on indigenous land cleared through attempted genocide, right? And I wanted to be, again, autofiction becomes the fiction of historic propensity. And that intersection, if I made everything sci-fi or fantasy, I would be kind of absolved of those true vexations. And nothing wrong with that, but I'm just disinterested in that. I like the stakes to be as real as life as you and I lived it in this moment.
You've said in the past, too, that you think universality is, I'm going to paraphrase you for a second, slightly overrated. And one of the things I really appreciate about Emperor of Gladness specifically is that the level of detail in these people's lives, that's the thing that gives the book its big beating heart, right? Like, I wasn't looking to have my experience reflected back at me necessarily, but I wanted to be invested in this community, in these people. I wanted to be invested in the story you were telling me, because there were a couple of moments too where I was like, okay, where are we going? I didn't know that woman had family. Okay. And you would zig where I thought you might zag, possibly. Right. And I love being surprised by that. But I was so invested.
It was important for me that you as a reader only know something when the characters know it.
Yeah.
That's a major craft principle for me. So this is in third person, which is tricky because it presents omniscience, but I wanted to deny the narrator omniscience, so you don't know someone's race until they tell you. You don't know their concerns. You don't know what they're interested in until you encounter it. There's nothing front loaded. And I think that's something, something only fiction can do. And I wanted to write a book that just fiction can do, which is why it started with an 8-page description of a town with no people in it, right? And people are not even there. I was getting like a lot, if I can allowed to be a little salty here. Like I was getting, as a novelist, as a professor, I get a lot of books from young writers, and I'm thinking of David Foster Wallace's Warning. I think in like 1991, he wrote this essay saying he said that his generation of writers were the first, most likely the first, to have consumed story via this TV more so than books, and that we're in trouble. He said books are now going to be derivative of TV. And he famously couldn't have a TV in his home, and now I'm seeing like the books that I get sent, they almost feel like either consciously or subconsciously they have kind of absorbed the beats of cinema and TV shows. And on my most cynical days, I'm like, is this an audition for an option? Or is this a novel? When I get really cynical about it, and I just thought, as a poet, we're kind of already outside of that frame. And I said, how sad would it be to study as a poet this very antithetical commercial form, anti-narrative form, and then kind of just like get roped into these strategies? What can I bring as a poet to this? And I thought, gosh, if I just resisted the medias res, the immediate action, the novel that picks up steam, or even the way we talk about possession, right? Grab the reader by their throat. It's like, do you want to grab anybody by their throat? Like, why is that a value system of us? Grab them, cling them, snatch them. And so I wanted the novel to kind of do what only fiction can do, going back to like Henry James and Melville and Virginia Woolf, and also like in this book, I'm deeply interested. I'm curious what you think, Miwa, because I think you're so, so well read and learned about this stuff. It's like, how do we feel about the idea of self-indulgence being an automatic, negative, denigrating position in fiction? Because I'm like, do I want Virginia Woolf to be any less indulgent? Right. And so to me, I think in this book, maybe again, because my mom is no longer with me, I would admit that this is probably my most self-indulgent book. And I don't know why that's a bad thing in the culture, where when other writers do it, like Cormac McCarthy's Suttree often said his most indulgent book, self-indulgent book, is one of my favorites. Baldwin's, another
country.
It's like,
I love that book.
I'm like, do we want them to indulge themselves any less, right? What is that? Is that some kind of puritanical Catholic shame about decorum? Is that an upper middle class, politeness that we want to perform?
No, I think we use it as a pejorative when we want to punish someone for doing the thing that they want to do. So Suttree is the McCarthy that I will go back to. There is some McCarthy that has not aged well, and no, thank you, I am not visiting that again. But Suttree is that was the first time I'd read McCarthy, and then I think for me it went Suttree, All the Pretty Horses. There we go. Suttree, All the Pretty Horses, then Blood Meridian. And then I went to some of the really early stuff, and I was like, thank you, no, I'm good. This is not...
Child of God.
Oh, no, thank you, no. What am I reading, and who are you, and yuck. I think when there are critics who think that they are in tune with whatever the artist intends or the writer intends, self-indulgence is a phrase that does not occur to them. I think self-indulgence is a phrase that gets thrown around when people are not clear or think somehow they are being spoken down to. Or just are itchy about what a writer or an artist is trying to do. That's how I feel about self-indulgence. Self-indulgence is not a word I would ever use, for a pulp writer.
Right.
And I think for a long time, too, it got slapped on women first.
Yes.
Another Country is a Baldwin novel that opening where Rufus is just being Rufus in Times Square.
Theaters and yeah,
or like Wolf in General.
Proust.
Okay, Proust. Yeah. Also, I finally read Middlemarch. Like, I have finally conquered the Middlemarch hell. I'm very glad I did it. Yes, I am very late to Middlemarch. But why would we call any of that self-indulgent when, I'm sorry, I've waded through some Charles Dickens and dude got paid by the word. Like,
Yep.
I think self-indulgent is just an easy pejorative. I think it's just shorthand that is not interesting to me when I see it in a review. I'm just
right.
Okay.
It's just an interesting thing that I've encountered, I think, as an outsider to this culture, because I was raised not only I was raised very Vietnamese, but like by Vietnamese refugee women in rural Vietnam.
Yeah.
So the values that I was when I had until I was like 15 was just so siloed away from Americana that even like now I think like I bring up the brothers Karamazov in this book
Yep.
because I kind of start to track something, and I'm curious of your thoughts here too, is that in the contemporary American space, we're often really uneasy with sincerity and earnestness.
Yeah.
And I think it's because we are in such a capitalistic society where so much of our language is the language of seduction. People try to win your vote, try to get you to buy something. You watch a Coca-Cola commercial, and it's not really a commercial about Coca-Cola. They're trying to sell you a lifestyle
Yeah.
or story, right? A feeling. And so to then not be sincere or earnest is to kind of not be duped. And so it behooves us to be cold, witty, ironic, and otherwise unmoved. And I think there's a kind of great embarrassment, particularly in American culture. And I say again, saying this as an outsider, one foot in, one foot out in a way, but raised here, that we immediately very skeptical, and God forbid you would be earnest in a workshop, right?
Right.
It's like, oh gosh, you really think you want to write a novel that captures this thing or that thing or does this philosophical thing? And yet, the novels that endure in our culture are incredibly sincere. Even Catcher in the Rye is so sincere in its vexation. And so I think actually Americans really do want an earnest investigation of their conditions, whatever that is to us. But we're embarrassed to say it aloud, which is why we're very comfortable with dead authors doing it. But when you say that, they said, "Oh God, who do you think you are?" Right. And I was stunned when I read the Russian authors, Turgenev, Dostoyevsky, Babel, where every ounce of them was so sincere because the questions and the stakes were so high. For Dostoevsky, what is the function of goodness in the face of internal demonic corruption? And it's just like he was so unafraid to ask that big, big question that I think even on a panel, if an American author said that, people would snicker a bit, right? And feel like uncomfortable. It's like, oh, surely you're joking, right? You don't really mean to capture the American zeitgeist or what have you. It's interesting that I kind of start to track that as an adult writer.
Yeah. You made me think of Augie March, actually, the Saul Bellow
Yeah,
novel,
yeah.
right? Like, I mean, there are people who hold that as a totem, and I've sort of been slowly picking my way through it. I quite like it, but it's ginormous, and I have a show to do, among other things. So, but that kind of epic American, I mean, you can see a sort of through line from Augie March to High and Sony and BJ and Wayne and Maureen and Russia.
Yeah.
And Grazia. I mean, to me, but I think earnestness, I think people are just scared. I think people are scared of being judged. I think people are scared of being seen as rubes or undereducated or what I think people are scared. And it just makes the argument for reading more.
Right. Yeah.
And spending more time with people who don't live down the street from you. I mean, it's every possible argument for reading as widely and as deeply as you can.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's about the people who are, working. Honestly, I hadn't thought about Boston Market in about 10,000 years, and I start reading this novel, and I'm like, oh, wow.
I heard it's dying. It's dying.
I know it is, but if you were a teenager in, Massachusetts or anywhere in New England in sort of the 80s and 90s, like you knew Boston Market.
Yeah.
All of these places. But there's a grounding here. There's a grounding here in the earnestness. And years ago, I had a boss say to me, "You're so earnest." And I'm like, "Why is that a bad thing?" And then I laughed at him and walked down the hallway. Cause
it's so interesting.
What do you do with that? Like, that's so a bad thing?
Yeah. Because, I go back to this line that the Buddha says in the Dhammapada, which is like his recorded lectures. And he said one of the tasks of one of his students said, "What do we do if we want to follow the way towards enlightenment, what do we do? And he says, you must study the phenomena of the world with earnestness. I'm stunned by that because he could have said anything else and it would still jive. He could have said with truthfulness, with effort, with honesty, with zealotry, right? With passion. But why did he say earnestness? And I think, again, when I talk about this with like my aunt, who's still in a kind of time capsule, that's what diaspora is. It's a time capsule, and it would be very confusing and baffling to her that anybody would go to work and not be earnest about what they do. It's a very quintessentially the skepticism and aversion, as you said, scared. The fear of being sincere is a quintessentially American fear. But I think it's more of reaction rather than what we truly want, because the books that we're and the media that we're interested in.
Right.
I mean, think of like, Tree of Life.
Yeah.
That film, it's like God, like Terrence Malick is one of the most earnest, it's one of the most earnest films, right? And we think through that, It's a Wonderful Life. Like talk about earnest and sincerity, like these things that we actually say we fear, we secretly value and carry, right? We lug it into the future while performing this kind of skepticism and cynicism, because I think there's a kind of blasé-ness to it. John Berger quite, I think, accurately diagnoses it. He says it's the gaze of the model, right? So in Ways of Seeing, he says the model doesn't look at the consumer. They look past the consumer with an air of abject boredom, as if to say, I am unmoved, and you want this stoic, you want to be so experienced and full of life that you are no longer moved by life, right? That's a place of a power, is to be undeterred. And gosh, it's so interesting, the conflation between those two. And I think that's why, to me, being vulnerable and earnest is the most courageous thing one can do as a writer, because you're going up against this kind of severe social embarrassment in a way that the novel is so capacious at providing, because it's so private.
It's private, but it's also, you can't get the same range of experience into a screen product.
Yeah.
You just can't. I mean, there are things that you can do, whether it's straight up craft, manipulation of time, manipulation of language, manipulation of, well, let's stick to time and language. But there are things that you can do in a novel that you simply cannot do in another art form. A piece of that, though, is gaze, right? And you just said this with the burger bit, but a gaze strips the humanity off of whoever is being held in the gaze, right? Because the gaze itself is the definition of I'm assigning value to you.
Yeah.
And it is based on my experience of the world, and I don't necessarily see what's in front of me. I am simply projecting myself onto you, and therefore that determines your value. Oh, yeah, hi, we need to talk about and so again, like voice and what's self-indulgent, all of these critical terms that we use to define an artistic experience. Shouldn't we be looking at how we're choosing those words? I mean, it sort of makes me think of that poem you have, Old Glory, that's in Time as a Mother, right? Where you're examining all of the language, and you've hit it here too. Like, why do we want to be grabbed by the throat by a novel and things like that? And of course, I started thinking about it because occasionally I get a little lazy in my descriptives, and I've resorted to language like that because sometimes you need shorthand. And now I'm thinking, ew. Ew, I don't want to do that.
And for, you're absolutely right. And for the record, I'm not interested. I'm disinterested in being like the police.
Right. No. I'm not.
Like, I use that too. Like I'm interested in like why does it work so much better to say you're killing it? Because I say that there's no other alternative, because we are now a culture that has, like Wittgenstein says, the meaning of a word is its use.
Yes.
And it's like we have used it this way. So that is, it's so interesting when you talk about translation, because I had my this pair of Danish translators. And there's this sweet, smart men, and they're working together and trying to translate Time as a Mother. And they were the first to flag Old Glory. And they said, we are so sorry. We can't translate this.
Yeah, I believe it.
And we're actually it's a bilingual edition. So we're going to just replicate the word in English on both sides when the translation should be, right? English, Danish. And then when it comes to Old Glory, it's English. Because they said our language can't map on to this sort of hyperbolic, figurative, canned gesture that the English said, like, bag the broad. Like we don't have, they're like, in a very respectful way, they're like, we don't have anything equivalent to bag the broad or spit roast, and so we're going to keep it American because doesn't exist here. And that was so interesting. And I joke with them. I said, I hope you're paid for the whole translation. Because even though I hope you got your whole fee, because Keith would say this is negative capability. You're recognizing a felt absence and accepting it for what it is. But it is interesting that our linguistic export is so powerful that it has no parallel in other cultures. And same with Vietnamese. Like my aunt and my family would be very perplexed when I say, in America they celebrate by talking about death, and in Vietnamese you talk about death visits you, right? Taboo. You don't even use those terms, especially not for celebration. But yeah, so interesting that you mentioned translation in that.
But also, I want to swing back to something you said about earnestness in the Buddha, because earnestness implies an open heart. And I think cynicism is the thing that you strap on sort of when you're going out to do battle with the world. Yeah, because if you show your belly, if you show your heart, you will be completely destroyed. And I think we're seeing these conversations in our culture right now, where people are dying of loneliness and people are finding themselves in horrible situations because we have defined masculinity in a certain way, or we have designed expectations that are just not reasonable for human beings. Like, have you met people? They're messy, they're weird, they're needy, they're squishy, like what? And that's where novels come in, right? Like you can spend time in those spaces in a way where, it used to be when you walked up and down in a plane, you could see all of the things people are reading, and now everyone's on their phone. And I'm like, well, some of you are reading, but I can't see the jacket. Same with the train, right? I get really excited when I'm like, oh, I can see the jacket. That's great. But this idea that you can sort of figure out what a place means, or who people mean, who people are to you.
Gosh, I was thinking of Didion when she says, one of my advantages as a writer, she says, is that I'm so small, I can walk into an elevator and disappear. Yep. And people will talk as if I don't exist. And I felt that way growing up in New England as an Asian boy, as an Asian American child. I saw what you're talking about, the hypermasculinity. I saw the other side of that. I saw the boys living in absolute vulnerability, fear, doubt. And I saw that America has given them such a narrow frame of acceptable masculinity that no human being can exist in it. If you are in 2004 or 5, you want to put your arm around your friend, you have to say, no homo. You needed a linguistic abracadabra for touch. And so we have deprived young men and boys with humanity and then asked them to never move from that. And I saw them in moments of deep concern and sadness when they failed to live up to that in ways their mom and dad would never see. And you're right, like to me, like the novel, like the Russia character, I'm interested in moments of like those lulls that Miyazaki uses, like the conversation after work, things that Western narratology would always cut out, right? And I let them have those moments because that's when all of the fears come out. And that's when, the humanity truly comes through.
That's also when a lot of stuff happens. I don't want people to think that stuff doesn't happen in The Emperor of Gladness. A lot. It is an epic novel in the best sense of the traditional American or Russian sort of epic.
Yeah, or Joycean,
Joycean, okay, we can use Joycean too.
My Irish grandfather would be happy that I mentioned
see?
Joycean. That Ulysses stuck in. It's like a one town journey to nowhere, and yet it is everywhere. It is the center, and I didn't want them to New York. The one thing I'm really happy about is that the idea of New York or Paris or San Francisco is just not relevant to these people, because it wasn't relevant to my family knew they existed, but it wasn't even available to them. Oh yeah, we know, yeah, we see it on TV, but it's not part of their concern. And try to explain that to a New Yorker, and they're like, "What do you mean? This is everyone should come here," But I think that's what I was interested in, is kind of creating a complete otherness wherein there is no North Star outside of the world that they live in.
I love that. I love that image. We've hinted at a lot happening in Emperor of Gladness that is going to be new for readers of you, whether it's the poems or the earlier novel On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. But High and Little Dog, and Little Dog's the narrator of Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, they share a little bit of ocean, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a little bit of ocean. But I think, too, there's an evolution that's happened between you writing Little Dog and Little Dog writing his piece, and you coming back later to write Emperor of Gladness.
Yeah.
And I'd like to leave readers on sort of your thoughts on what shifted, because, I mean, yes, you're going from close first and epistolary, but it's more than just the format. I think there's a deeper connection that isn't just about the book's format or the book's creator, for that matter, even though you are you are the guy driving all of it.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that. Well, one of the impulses of the Emperor of Gladness was me returning to On Earth and realizing that it is a document, a letter from a son to a mother, and it's a document that masquerades as a novel. Of course, I was writing a novel. It's many of the things in there are invented, but the way it exists, the way it's consumed, is a document. And the question that I had to ask myself, because of course Little Dog has aspirations to be a writer, and I thought, what would Little Dog's debut novel look like if he were to write a novel? And not only stylistically, of course, it'll be in third person and a traditional novel, but also what part of his life would he reveal, and what would he keep off the page? And that's really important to me, that I don't think a novel is something that should be a tell-all. Like Gergina, there's parts of Gergina's life that High is not privy to, right? We don't, just because we're reading a book doesn't mean we're privy to everything about it, including the characters' lives. They get to have their secrets. That's important to me, just in principle as a writer. But that was the fun. It's not a sequel or prequel in any way, but that was the impulse. It's if Little Dog had to write a debut, and the book that becomes his public facing, no longer to his mother. It's the book where he faces the public as an Asian American character, an entity, a maker, a thinker. What would he write? What would he call it? And what part of his life would he focus on? And that would be the Emperor of Gladness.
And that makes me so happy to hear. I love the idea that we're living in a world that is shared by all of these people, and the poems, and you, and me. I think it's great. I'm just really pleased. Ocean Vuong, it was so good to see you. This was great. We should take this act on the road. I would love to.
Yeah, and I gotta maybe I have to write books faster so I can talk to you more often.
That would be excellent. However, the work does what the work does, so I can be patient.
Likewise.
Hello, readers. It's time for another TBR Top Off. We're going to recommend a couple of wonderful books to pick up when you stop in for your copy of The Emperor of Gladness. I'm Mark at my Barnes & Noble in Cincinnati, and I'm joined by my book buddy Donald in Detroit. Hello, Donald. How are you?
Hey, Mark. Hey, everybody.
So, first off, I am so excited for Emperor of Gladness. I love Ocean Vuong. I think this book is one of my most anticipated of this year, and I think everything that he does is perfect. The poetry, the prose, just listening to Ocean speak is a miracle in and of itself. I love him. But it made me want to recommend a book that plays with structure and voice and genre in a way that opens doors to how fiction can live, very similar to the novels that Ocean Vuong has put out. And that's the novel Dayspring by Anthony Oliveira. Oh my God, this book. This is a retelling of the Gospels from one of Jesus's disciples, but it places the narrative in a sort of version of our time and biblical times. It plays with time and space so well, but also infuses it with queer love. And the structure is very much in line with that of the Bible and the way that it's written, the way that the words of Jesus are read. And it carries messages of faith and love in a way that I really haven't seen before. It's something that you can tell the author has treated all of these words with the utmost respect and fascination and curiosity and playfulness. It's just so unusual and wonderful. The way that he creates this mixture of poetry and free verse, narrative, biblical passages. It's very ambitious and really astounding in the final product. I think it's very, very impressive. I can't imagine the amount of research and time that was put into this book to really make it sing the way that it does. It's just something to savor and return to and cherish. It's just really a feat of storytelling that I have not really seen before. And that is Dayspring by Anthony Oliveira. Also, one of the best book covers I saw last year. Donald, what do you have for us?
So this was a little bit more of a challenge, right? Because I think he stands in his own bubble as a writer. So I was looking, okay, who else do I know? Who else have I read that really is, one all on their own? And so I went with a brand new book by bestselling author Isabel Allende. And it's her newest book, My Name is Amelia Duval. And what's really interesting that I learned when I read this, it is technically tied to The House of the Spirits, which is the book that put her on the map a few decades ago. But the reason why I chose this particular book is it's also dealing with memory and loss and identity, destiny even. It's poetic and it's also filled with magical realism and sense of place and time. It's historical. Starts out in 1866, goes into a couple of decades, but it really focuses on Amelia and her journey in just discovering who she is and her place in the world, while also being a woman in times where, again, being a woman just wasn't a really good time for them, right? Like they weren't allowed to do much, they weren't allowed to express themselves, and so she pushes the envelope, becoming a very self-sufficient and independent thinker. She deals and defies social norms, and again, just finds her place in her family. She discovers all kinds of things down the road. But it's a slim read, it's a quick read, but you'll fall in love with her language just as much as you would when reading Emperor of Gladness. So again, that was Isabel Allende and her new book, My Name is Amelia Duval.
Fantastic. And I would say that like Allende and Vuong, I would now put Oliveira into this category of writers who seem like they have fallen from the sky or were plucked from a forest or just came out of some magical place and they're just sort of blessing us with their presence and the way that they magically spin words. So nice work. But that is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in to Poured Over. Please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. And you can follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. I'm Mark. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester. Donald, where can we find you?
I am now in a new location, so you can follow me at BN Livonia.
Oh, lovely. I know Livonia fairly well. All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Happy reading.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.